Welcome to another episode of Season of Tears, the podcast that uncovers stories, one of the darkest chapters of Sri Lankan history. Join us on this creeping journey through time. We'll be shining a light on forgotten tales of resilience and hope from those who lived through the riots of July 1983. Let's listen to the next story in the Season of Tears.
You know how in Sri Lanka we have these school rivalries, right? Where we compete with each other in sports and drama competitions and things. So the school that I considered a rival when I was little was Holy Family Convent Bambalapitiya. But, never in a million years did I imagine, in my wildest dreams even, that I would visit that school as a refugee. But that is exactly what happened. And one of my most vivid memories from that time is of standing in the middle of that school with my parents and grandparents and sister, just looking around and feeling really lost and confused. And there were so many people, seated on mats. There were people crying. I remember small children, old people, and people who had just run away fearing for their lives, who had lost everything, who didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. And that feeling is something that doesn't go away. My name is Shamindrini, and I grew up in a quiet corner of Kotte, which is about 10 kilometers from Colombo. I have really fond memories of my neighborhood and still consider myself a Kotte girl, because we had some good times there. I had lovely neighbors, some of whom are still there, and we would play together, and really it was a nice, quiet, peaceful neighborhood. So in July that year, I was just 8 years old. In fact, my birthday had been just the week before. And if I were to tell you a bit about myself, I would say that my family is mixed. My father's father is Tamil from Jaffna, and I studied in the Sinhala medium, and actually that is where my first brush with racism was, because my class teacher that year in 1983, she made this comment and it has stuck in my mind. So she said, she actually asked us why there were Tamil children studying in the Sinhala medium, and this comment was directed at myself and another girl also of mixed parentage. And it was the tone she said it in, and that is what I remember, though I can't quite recall the context of that comment, but I clearly understood her tone and the fact that it was said with a certain amount of anger and hatred, and I simply couldn't forget that. So anyway, going back to that week, now July 25th was a Monday, and as usual, my sister and I woke up early because we had to be ready for our school van, which would take us to school from Kotte, and this van would come by about 6:30. So it was only recently, when I was talking about this with my father, that he said that my grandfather had warned him not to go to work on that Monday. He had called him on the 24th night and said, "Don't go to work. I heard there was some trouble in Colombo." But of course, my father, being my father, didn't listen to my grandfather, and none of them thought that anything like this would happen. So we got ready, we got into the school van and went off to school. Now the van was driven by Gamini uncle, who I think he reached Nugegoda when he heard something on the radio, and then he immediately stopped the van, turned it around and started driving back home. And soon he was at our gate talking to my mother, and I think at that that point he had said that he had heard that there was trouble in Colombo and that it was not safe for us to go to school. And he had actually offered to take me and my sister to his house for safekeeping. But my mother asked him to drop us off at her mother's house, which was close by. And so that is where Gamini uncle dropped us off. Then a little while after we went to my grandparents' house, my mother's sister and her husband also turned up. They had been going on their weekly vegetable shopping or something, and their little motorbike had run out of petrol, so they had decided to wheel it to my grandmother's house, which was also close by. Anyway, they turned up, and a little while later my father also came. He had been on his way to work when at Narayampita he had seen all the buildings on fire and everything, and he had sensed that it was not safe at all, so he had quickly turned around and headed back to my grandparents' house instead of coming home to Kotte. And at this point the grown-ups had a discussion, and they thought, right, things are not going to get any better. It is best to be safe and to sort of go into hiding. And then they decided to send my grandfather's van to collect my mother, who was still at home, as well as my father's parents. Another distinct memory just pops up when I remember that, and that is of my mother wrapping glasses in newspaper. So when we went to pick her up, my sister and I also jumped into the van because we just wanted a free ride. We didn't realize the gravity of the situation. So when we went home to Kotte to collect my mother, she was simply just wrapping everything in newspaper, all her little glasses, and taking her own sweet time, because there was no urgency and nobody really thought that it would end where it did. So my mother was simply just packing things calmly. She put everything into the van until she couldn't fit anything else in there. And then we went over to Baddagana, which is where my father's parents lived, and we picked them up. They got into the van with just a change of clothes, and that was it. And then off we went to my mother's parents' house. So then it was decided that we should split up because there were too many of us there at my mother's parents' house. So while my father's parents stayed on, my family, that is my parents, my sister and I, went to my aunt's and uncle's place in Gangoda Villa. Now there we spent the day indoors, really, and I remember being told to be very quiet, and we just didn't make any noise or try to draw any attention to ourselves at all. And by evening that day, my aunt and uncle wanted to just find out what was happening at my grandparents' house. So they went around the neighborhood looking for somewhere with a telephone, because those days not every house had telephones, right? They met a boy who showed them a house with a telephone, and so that's where my aunt and uncle went to make a call. And anyway, they got through to my grandparents, and when they spoke to them, my grandmother had given the news that my other grandparents' house had been burnt down by that time. And so hearing this, my aunt had got really upset and she had started crying. That man whose telephone they had used asked my aunt why they were crying. My aunt had said, her sisters-in-laws were Tamils and that their house had been burnt. He didn't know it at the time, but somebody had overheard this conversation, tipped off the mobs that there was a Tamil family hiding in the area. Anyway, the following morning, my aunt had gone into the garden to put out some clothes when she overheard a neighbor talking quite loudly. In fact, he had been bragging that he had been on his way home on his motorbike when he was stopped by a mob and they had demanded petrol. And he had said, "Oh, take as much petrol as you want because these Tamils need to be taught a lesson." Now, when my aunt heard that, she had really started panicking because here was all of us. We were hiding in her little annex, and this man next door was saying this, right? So she didn't know what to do. And then, of course, a little while later, another neighbor who was just behind her house had called her to the fence and in a quiet voice asked her if she was hiding anyone. When my aunt heard that, she didn't know what to do. And initially she denied everything, but that lady had kept on asking her, and my aunt, who was only about 23 years old at the time, simply couldn't withstand the pressure, and she had burst into tears, and she had admitted that yes, her sister's family was with them. Now at that point, that lady, I'll call her Mrs. M, she had reassured my aunt and said, no, don't worry, we won't do anything. In fact, the reason I asked you is because there had been a mob going around and around the neighborhood last night, armed with knives and sticks, looking for a Tamil family. Then Mrs. M told my aunt to send my father over the fence to their home to spend the night, that it would be safer there. And so that is exactly what happened. Now, Mr. M spent that night holding my father's hand, reassuring him that everything would be okay and not to worry. By the following morning, my uncle had managed to obtain some curfew passes, and then we decided to go to a refugee camp. And on the way, I remember we passed the body of a man who had been killed that previous night by the mobs. So we collected our other grandparents and off we went to Holy Family Convent, Bambalapitia, where we became refugees, in our own city, displaced in our own country. Anyway, after we went to the camp, my aunt decided to go back to our place to find out how things were. And so she and my grandmother went back to our home in Kotte. And while they were there, they got the news that there were mobs who were going from lane to lane looking for Tamil houses. And soon, of course, they turned up at our home, right? And there was my grandmother and my aunt trying to face off with this mob. My grandmother was pleading with them. She was armed with just a prayer book and her rosary, I think. And she was just pleading with them not to burn the house. And when one of the men in the mob, shouted at her and asked her why she gave her daughter to a Tamil. Then they had spotted my aunt and started yelling at her, saying, oh, this is the one that married a Tamil. So they were almost getting ready to attack her. In the meantime, one or two of the men had managed to get into the house and they had broken a few things. But anyway, our neighbors, they were wonderful. They somehow managed to convince the mob to leave without causing any further damage. And so that is how they all left. We stayed in the refugee camp for the next couple of days until the situation calmed down. And later we were joined by my father's sister and her husband, who had come down from overseas for the birth of their second child. When they got to the airport, they had actually called my grandparents and they had not had any answer. So then after that, they tried our home and my mother's mother picked up. And then my aunt had said to her, I'm calling my parents, why aren't they picking up? So how was she to tell them that they couldn't pick up because they were not there and that the house was burnt down? The house that she knew and the house that she thought she was coming home to was no longer there. After everything was over and we returned home, we went to Badagana to see my grandparents' house, or actually what was left of it. And honestly, to this day, I can picture the ashes in the house, the blackened walls, and the broken furniture. I even found a gold bangle that belonged to my grandmother. It was lying in the ashes and I picked it out. And that was one thing that the mobs had missed. There were 4 Tamil houses in the neighborhood there, actually adjoining each other, and they were all burnt. And of course, before they were burnt, they were looted. Now, these are all people from the area, local thugs and just random people who turned up together to loot and burn. They stole my grandmother's sewing machine, and the man who stole it had a tailoring shop at the top of the lane, and that he used the machine there. He set it up there, and my grandmother had to see it every day that she passed by. Can you imagine that? It was unbelievable, right? But of course, no one was brought to justice, and we couldn't complain. And we just had to pick up the pieces and carry on. And that was our experience